Hey y'all, Zach here from World of Game Design with another entry in my How to Play series. This one is for a game that I've been running now for a few months and really enjoyed. It's put out by Free League and is their dark horror fantasy game. One of several at this point. We're playing it because its lore intrigued me, and it uses its very own system, which I also wanted to try out. It's called Symbaroum, and please note this game doesn't use Free League's traditional Year Zero engine system, like a lot of their other games, nor is this video, this how to play video, about the Ruins of Symbaroum set of books that utilizes the same setting, but in a 5e context. This is for the set in stone traditional Symbaroum that was put out first. Okay, with that out of the way, let's dive into it. So what can you expect from a game of Symbaroum? Well, as I said, it's very grim and also very deadly. The crux of the presented setting is that these humans, called Ambrians, have fled from a dark power in the south, leaving their kingdom behind, crossing over a mountain range, and settling in a valley right next to a massive forest called Davokar. The forest is pockmarked with ancient ruins of the long-fallen empire of Symbaroum, and is still guarded by fierce elves. There's goblins, ogres, human barbarians, changelings, and other humanoids that dot the landscape, as well as creatures of blight and shadow. As an adventurer in Symbaroum, you're almost certainly some form of treasure hunter, plunging into dungeons and deep forest in hopes of uncovering valuable artifacts. Barring that, you probably are warring against agents of shadow. No one likes these guys. You'll be trading blows with vile creatures and terrifying monsters, rubbing shoulders with newfound neighbors, and questioning the motivations behind every interaction. Now that we know a little bit about its themes, let's take a look at the dice. Symbaroum uses a d20 for most rolls, just like D&D. But unlike D&D, high numbers aren't good on a d20 test. You want to roll low. Roll at or below your target number and you have a success. With tests, there's no critical successes or failures, though your game master is welcome to embellish them. In addition, the game doesn't typically use modifiers for dice, or doesn't modify those dice. It instead modifies attributes. Let's say that your vigilant attribute is a 10. That would be equivalent in D&D terms to saying that your wisdom score is a 10. You'll need to roll a 10 or lower on the d20 in order to succeed. But if you get a +2 bonus for something special, that +2 bonus applies to your vigilance score, making it, for that roll, a 12. It's a small difference from what you've probably come to expect in an RPG, so make sure that you've got that firmly in mind before you go on. Bonuses apply to your attributes, which means that the watermark for success is changed. It does not affect your d20 roll itself. Other dice, like d6s and d8s, are typically just rolled in combat for different types of damage. That's basically it on the dice front, though. Probably about the same amount of dice complexity as D&D, just the math works differently. Moving on, let's look at the character sheet. Your character is centered around 8 attributes. Accurate is used for all weapon attacks, both melee and ranged. Cunning is used for wit and knowledge, like puzzles or library research. Discreet covers silence, agility, and discretion, things like smuggling or shadowing a person. Persuasive is how well you can influence others. Quick is your reflexes and balance. It's also how you avoid attacks. Resolute is your ability to resist pressures and influence in social situations, but also your ability to resist dangerous magic and the influence of shadow. This is a super important attribute, especially if you want to wield magics yourself. Strong is feats of strength and your ability to withstand poisons and disease. And finally, vigilant is your awareness and attunement to your own senses. Of all of these, Probably accurate, quick, and resolute will be the most consistently important. Now, another cool thing is that several of these attributes are kind of foils to each other. As an example, when you attack with accurate, the enemy opposes with quick. Pretty much always. Similarly, persuasive is opposed by resolute, and discreet is opposed by vigilant. This makes a lot of sense, and the practicality of the approach means that it's easy to determine how to adjudicate lots of checks. If you have a player that is trying to be persuasive and they want to roll a test, you know that any enemies, whoever they're trying to persuade, needs to be rolling a resolute test. More on that in a minute, though, because it's not always a roll-off. There's other ways that can be handled. There's also several things called secondary attributes. In D&D, we wouldn't call these attributes. Maybe we would call one of them hit points and things like that. But here, they're called secondary attributes. Toughness is one of these. Toughness equals your strong score and is basically your hit points. That said, you also have a pain threshold, which is half of your strong score rounded up. Your pain threshold, or that of your enemy, is the way of calculating if a hit is extra devastating. If the damage from a single attack is higher than the target's pain threshold, then the player gets to decide whether the target gets knocked to the ground or if the attacker gets to make a free attack. Please note, the player gets to determine this, even if they are the target. It's never adjudicated by the GM. Defense is another secondary attribute, but it's really just your quick score modified by any armor that you're wearing. Some heavier armor subtract from your quick score for defense, while others do not. We'll cover armor more in the combat section, but for now, just keep in mind that heavier armors will definitely hurt your quick and defense scores in certain situations. Finally, we come to extra special secondary attributes called corruption and corruption threshold. You can calculate your corruption threshold by having your resolute attribute and rounding up. So if your resolute attribute is 11, you are going to have a corruption threshold of 6. Okay, other homework here. When you make a character, you have 80 points to spend in your main attributes, and you can place them anywhere. But only one can be as high as 15, and none can be lower than 5. Moving on, your race is of enormous importance in this game. Like most games of D&D, kind of hand-wave the importance of your race and culture, especially mechanically. But here, you literally have no more important choice. Races are the crux of the setting. You could play as either an Ambrian human, a barbarian human, a goblin, an ogre, or a changeling, with more races available in the Advanced Player's Guide. All of these races are intermingling and adjusting to the new boundaries as the Ambrians establish their empire in the new land. All of these races have fascinating deviations from what you might expect in other settings, fantasy settings, especially the monstrous ogres and the intriguing changelings, which are basically elves that grow up outside of the perimeter of the Davokar forest. Somehow, growing up outside the forest distinguishes them, changes them physically, biologically, from elves that grow up inside. There's something to chew on with every racial interaction, and you're going to find your party wanting to delve further and farther into the individual histories. Your race choice will also give you at least one trait. In the Advanced Player's Guide, they move to calling these traits, racial traits, boons instead. This is probably a pretty good time to tell you that the Advanced Player's Guide is really, really good and adds additional depth to character creation and advancement options. 2 more sections and then we're on to combat and wrapping this up. You'll notice a section for an archetype, which is kind of like your class, but this is deceptive. You might imagine that choosing an archetype and then a corresponding occupation, i.e. subclass, is mandatory. But it's really not. They are kind of guidance templates to assist you in narrowing down in your creation options. There are a ton of creation options to choose from. So many traits, so many things that you can build your character around, that it can be overwhelming. But you can deviate from these suggested archetypes and occupations and their directives, or you can avoid them altogether and just make your own build based around everything. In truth, your character build centers around abilities, and pretty much all the characters can select from all the abilities, unless an ability is specifically tied to your race or some other particularity. Let's reference this like D&D. Imagine if you didn't pick a class, but at level 1, you could choose a couple of level 1 options from any class, and then continue to mix and match as you leveled. That's basically how this works. You don't take a level in Wizard, and then your second level you take a level in Fighter. You just level up, and you pick whatever abilities you want for that level. That said, I highly recommend the archetypes and occupations, as the guidance they give is excellent, and the occupation's flavor is very valuable. There is an enormous list of abilities, as I said earlier, and most of them have 3 tiers. You have to progress through the tiers one at a time, and there's no skipping. So tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 in order. At first level, you can either have 2 novice level of abilities, so that's tier 2, tier 1 abilities, and 1 that's tier 2 called adept, or you can have 5 at novice level, tier 1, and none at tier 2. You'll want to spend a lot of time, probably, poring over these options, but there's one that stands out among the rest. Mystical Power. Mystical Power is a trait that allows you to take a new power, otherwise known as a spell. Each time you want to learn a new power spell, you'll need to take a new, separate selection of the Mystical Power ability. Let me say that again. If you want to know 2 spells, you'll need to take the Mystical Power ability twice, both at novice level. You can then level up the power, or the spell, by progressing to the higher tiers, the adept tier or the master tier for that spell, thereby making the power more useful. Now here's the thing. Mystical Power is highly corruptive. The untrained individual who attempts to utilize this power is going to see themselves taking on points of temporary corruption all the time, which will be devastating. Corruption is one of these ways that you can lose your character in addition to just losing all your hit points and dying. Basically, your corruption threshold, which we mentioned earlier, functions as your number of spell slots, but it's way, way more dangerous than just becoming exhausted. Rising points of corruption, both temporary and permanent forms, can result in you becoming a creature of shadow and blight, and may result in you losing your character altogether. Hitting a combination of temporary and permanent corruption equal to your threshold means that you are blight marked and gain a stigma. Stigma are typically physical characteristics or personality traits or quirks that are detrimental and that are seen as repulsive by those around you. Hitting a combination of corruption that is double your threshold means that you become an abomination and are no longer viable as a player character. You can read more about shadow and corruption starting on page 175, and this is a pretty key aspect to the setting and to the game, so definitely read some more of that before you start. To avoid some of these devastating effects, most characters that wish to cast powers will want to join a mystical tradition, like wizardry, sorcery, or witchcraft. Joining a tradition is also an ability that you would choose and level up in, and cost the same as any other ability. You can be a novice wizard, an adept wizard, or an adept master. And you can actually mix and match and take levels in various ones of these to get different effects. That's basically it for character creation, other than selecting gear and equipment, especially if your group is not using the Advanced Player's Guide. I guess that means it's time to talk about combat. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Symbaroum is a game that puts most of the dice rolls in the hands of the players, not the GM. Almost every roll is made by the players. Combat is no different. At the start, the combatant with the highest quick score goes first, or chooses to go later, and then the turn order descends in order of quick. During the first round of combat, characters with long weapons, that's a trait that a weapon can have, also get to make a free attack against a melee enemy if that enemy doesn't also have a long weapon. During your turn, you can make a move action and a combat action. Movement actions are things like moving to engage in melee, flanking an enemy, disengaging, standing up, or drinking an elixir. Notice that we're not talking about squares or feet here. It's more subjective. It's more theater of the mind by its intent. Combat actions are things like using a weapon, casting a mystical power, applying first aid, or moving again if you want to move twice. You can also perform free actions and reactions if the right triggers are in place. Typically, those are tied to your abilities that you've selected. NPCs and monster stat blocks list out the same attributes as the players, along with a modifier noted in parentheses. When a player attacks a monster, the player will typically make an accurate test, and it will be modified by the monster's quickness modifier. Remember earlier we talked about there being opposed attributes? This is that in action. You're making an accurate test, it's opposed by the monster's quick. As an example, let's say your accurate was 14 and the monster's quick modifier was +1. This would mean that the monster is a bit slower than average, and the player will have to reach or roll under a 15 instead of their usual 14 to hit them. 14 plus the quick modifier of +1 equals 15. That means you have a little bit more of a chance to succeed. If another monster has a -2 modifier, that monster is a bit quicker than average, and the player will have to roll at or under a 12, 14 minus 2 is 12, with their accurate to hit them. The same works in reverse when a monster attacks a PC. The PC, the player character, will make a quick test modified by their own armor and the accurate modifier of the monster. So maybe your armor says, hey, if your quick is 14, you have to subtract a couple from that, and then the monster says, hey, my their accurate is -2, so you're going to -2 again from that. So especially if you're wearing bulky armor and you're up against quick monsters, you're going to be subtracting a lot from your quick score before you roll. When damage is dealt, PCs roll damage dice, and monsters usually deal static damage that's basically an average for whatever dice they would have rolled. For instance, the monster might deal 4 damage for a sword, whereas a PC would roll a d8. Remember that if the total damage dealt reaches the target's pain threshold, the attacker gets to the PC gets to determine if the target is either knocked prone or becomes the recipient of an extra attack. In order for damage to be dealt, though, it's going to first have to get through armor. Now, armor works as damage reduction, reducing damage dealt by a single die, with light armor starting out as subtracting a d4, and heavy armor all the way up to heavy armor reducing a d8. Armor is going to save your bacon over and over again, so get yourself a sturdy set and keep it in good order. If you don't, we get to talk about death and dying. Monsters and NPCs die when their toughness score is reduced to 0. PCs, player characters, get special treatment, but it's still nasty. When you drop to 0, you're considered dying and you fall unconscious. Each turn from there on out, you roll a d20. Sounds like D&D, right? It's not. You roll a critical success. If you roll a critical success, which in this game is a 1, because keep in mind rolling low on a d20 is super great. If you roll a critical success, you still stabilize. And if you roll a critical failure, a d20, a 20, you auto-die. But anything in between, counts as a strike. And 3 strikes and you're out. What does this mean? It means if you drop, you're almost certainly dead in 3 rounds, unless a comrade heals you. And healing isn't a guarantee. I've seen parties who have 0 healing ability running around for multiple sessions. It's scary. Healing is not as prevalent as it is in Dungeons & Dragons. If you fall to 0, there's a very good chance that you're going to die. And that's really the best way to underscore Symbaroum. It's scary. It's a tough world. Tomorrow isn't promised, but there's still just enough opportunities around to push you forward. Of all the settings for all the various fantasy RPGs out there, this one sits right up there with Middle-earth for me, and for those that fascinate the most. I strongly recommend you check out this game, even if just for the setting. That's it, folks. That's the video. As always, I'll drop links to where you can pick up your own copy of Symbaroum in the show notes below. If you're looking for more of a grim and deadly substitute for D&D, then this just might do the trick. Keeping in mind that half of the coolness of Symbaroum is found in its setting and lore, so you might not get as much of a bang for your buck if you're going, or you plan on going, homebrew for a lot of that. If you like this video, consider subscribing to our channel. We have lots of great content and different playlists, all centered around getting you into more RPGs and making those games better. We also have a podcast. It's called Geeks Can't, and it features me and a couple of my Yahoo Game Masters friends chatting about topics that came up at our tables, Kickstarters, RPG news, and interviewing creators by the dozens. Go give us a listen if podcasts are your thing. It's also recorded live right here on YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook pretty much every week. You can expect a video just like this one on a different RPG system every few weeks. And until then, we'll see you next time.